The man at the doorstep came for my father when he turned 37. I was 10 years old at the time. It started with a single knock at the door in the middle of the night. Knock, followed by another, knock, and so on. I heard the sounds first, and eventually so did my dad. I remember hearing him step out of my parents' bedroom in the dark and stop in the hallway as he listened while the knocking continued. Knock, over ... knock, and over. Knock, and over, until he finally went downstairs and opened the door. And by the time I made it to the staircase to see who it was, my dad was already gone, our front door slamming behind him. Not long after, his disappearance was ruled a missing persons case. The leading theory being that he suffered from depression and just decided to wake up one night, wander off into the night, and end his own life. But I knew the truth. I knew what had really happened to him. I had heard the man at the doorstep ... Unfortunately, no matter how many times I tried to explain what I had heard, no one believed me. Not the cops, not my mom, and not even my friends. So as I grew up, I began to doubt myself, doubt my memory, doubt my ability to separate my childhood imagination from reality. And I eventually resolved to buy into the suicide theory that the police had proposed. That is, until one day, at the age of 37, the man at the doorstep returned. It started with a single knock at the door in the middle of the night. Knock ... followed by another, knock, and so on. Being the sole occupant of the house handed down to me from my mother, and a single one at that, I was the only one to hear the sound. I stepped out of what was now my bedroom and formerly my parents' bedroom, in the dark, and stopped in the hallway, as I listened, while the knocking continued. Knock, over ... knock, and over. Knock, and over, until I finally went downstairs. But unlike my father, I didn't open the door. I simply tiptoed up to it and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, on the other side of the door was the silhouette of a hooded man, knocking away. Over, and over, and over. But knowing the fate that had befallen my father, there was no way I was going to answer him. So, just tiptoed over to the staircase, took a seat on one of the steps. Knock. I waited ... and waited ... and waited for him to stop ... knock ... but he never did. Minutes turned 2 hours, and before I knew it, the sun began to rise ... That's when the knocking stopped, and the man at the doorstep simply walked away. The next day was business as usual, as I went about another hectic workday, and almost forgot what had happened the night before, eventually chalking it up to a nightmare. But later that night, after I went to bed, I awoke to the chilling sound of a single knock at the door. Knock, followed by another, and so on. Once again, I tiptoed downstairs, looked through the peephole, and saw the same shadowy silhouette of a hooded figure, knocking away at the door. Knowing that this was no dream, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a steak knife, and tiptoed over to the staircase, where I took a seat on one of the steps. Knock. I waited ... and waited ... and waited for him to stop, but he never did. Once again, minutes turned 2 hours, and before I knew it, it was 5 a.m. But sunrise was still an hour away, and I found myself beginning to lose it, as I grew increasingly disturbed with every ... knock, single ... knock, tap at the door ... until eventually ... I couldn't take it anymore, and rather than calling the police, or hopping out a window and running away, I worked up the courage to face my fears and ... opened the door. The hooded figure said nothing. He simply turned around and started walking away, before turning back and gesturing for me to follow him. Still holding the steak knife, I felt compelled to do as he asked, and a few minutes later, I found myself following him into the darkness of the forest behind my house, the only light that of the moon shining through the trees. He didn't turn around once. He just kept walking, and walking, and walking, while I followed behind him, my sweaty hands struggling to keep a solid grip on the steak knife. And after walking for what must have been 10 minutes in the dark, he eventually took a seat by a smoldering fire, and gestured for me to sit next to him. That's when he removed his hood, and revealed a familiar face ... that of my father. "Dad, Isaac, where have you been? And what were you doing at the house? Where? Waiting? What? Knocking? But why? It's time you knew the secret." Secret. We have something of a tradition in this family. What kind of tradition? But by the time I finished my question, I had already started to piece everything together. If the man at the doorstep took my father at the age of 37, and my father is now the man at the doorstep, and I am at the age of 37 ... "You're next in line," he said. But then what became of the last man at the doorstep, who I began to realize must have been my grandfather? I wondered. "I'm glad you brought the blade," he said, looking at the steak knife that I'd brought from the kitchen. "It's as if you knew that you must kill me and take over my watch until your own child turns 37. But I don't have a child yet, Dad. I'm not gonna hurt you. The tradition states that if you do not, I must kill you instead and end our bloodline once and for all. You ... kill ... me, your son, Dad. I haven't been your father in 27 years. I'm something ... else ... now." That's when he pulled out a knife of his own. I stood up, my body shaking, as he did the same. "Don't make me do it. Just tell me you'll kill me, and I'll explain everything before you do," he insisted. Of course, I didn't have the will to do as he asked. So, instead, I made a run for it, back through the dark forest, under the light of the moon as it shone through the trees. But his legs were longer than mine, and in no time he had caught up to me and cornered me against a tree. "You can still save yourself. Just say it. Isaac, say that you'll kill me." "Never," I said defiantly, tossing my steak knife down to the ground. "Then so it must be," he said, without any emotion, as he walked over and swung at me with his own knife. I caught his arm before his blade could wound me, and, wrestling with him in the dark of night, somehow managed to push him back with all my might. He must have tripped on some of the forest underbrush, and the next thing I knew, he had impaled himself on the very steak knife I had thrown away in an attempt to avoid hurting him. "Nicely done. It is your turn now," he said, looking down at his blade, as blood poured from his mouth, and his eyes rolled back in his head. "Dad, no," I cried out, but it was too late. It took me years to get over the experience, and even longer to even remotely consider having a child of my own. But eventually, when enough time had passed, I got married and had a baby boy. And while I would never, ever do anything to harm him, every once in a while, I wonder if, when he turns 37, I might feel compelled to stand at his door and knock over ... and over ... and over, until he finally goes downstairs and opens the door. The doctors told me it was a miracle that I survived. They said it was a 1 in a million shot of bullet that should have killed me instantly, but somehow left me clinging to life. I remember the flash of pain, the darkness swallowing me whole, and then nothing. When I woke up in the hospital, everything was different. I was blind. The hunting trip was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my friends, a chance to escape the monotony of daily life and enjoy the peace of the woods. We had been laughing, sharing old stories around the campfire, when I felt it. A sharp, searing pain exploded in my skull, and then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, my world was shrouded in darkness. The doctors explained that the bullet had damaged my optic nerves irreparably. I would never see again. At first, I was consumed by rage and despair. How could this happen to me? But soon, other sensations crept in, things that made my blood run cold. It started with the voices. At night, when the world was quiet, I would hear whispers, soft and indistinct. They seemed to come from, and thus beyond the edges of my perception, always slipping away when I tried to focus on them. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the trauma. But the voices grew louder, more insistent. "He's coming," they would say. "He sees you." I tried to ignore them, but the whispers followed me everywhere. During the day, I would feel cold fingers brushing against my skin, fleeting touches that sent shivers down my spine. My friends and family told me it was just my imagination, that I was adjusting to my new reality. But I knew better. Something was wrong. Something was watching me. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers became screams. Terrifying, blood-curdling screams that filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and felt a presence in the room with me. It was cold, malevolent, and it pressed down on me, suffocating me with its darkness. I reached out, hoping to find something, anything, to reassure me that I was alone. My hands brushed against something cold and clammy, like rotting flesh. I recoiled in horror, but the presence only grew stronger. I could feel it breathing down my neck, its rancid breath hot against my skin. "Leave me alone," I screamed, thrashing wildly. My hand struck something solid, and I heard a low, guttural growl. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled out of bed, stumbling blindly through my room. I could hear it following me, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. I fled to the living room, collapsing on the floor in a heap. The whispers returned, softer this time, but more insidious. They wormed their way into my mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear. I was losing my grip on reality, and I knew it. Days turned into weeks, and the hauntings grew worse. The visions started next. Even in my blindness, I saw them, dark, twisted shapes lurking in the corners of my mind. They would slither and writhe, their forms constantly shifting. Sometimes, they had faces, ghastly, contorted faces with hollow eyes that stared into my soul. I stopped sleeping, too terrified to close my eyes. Every time I did, the visions would consume me, dragging me down into a pit of madness. My friends tried to help, but they couldn't understand. They couldn't see what I saw, hear what I heard. One night, as I sat in my living room, clutching a knife for protection, I heard the front door creak open. My heart raced, and I strained to listen. Footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow and deliberate. I knew it wasn't one of my friends. They had all but abandoned me, unable to deal with my growing paranoia. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, and I could feel the presence watching me. It was the same malevolent force that had haunted me since the accident, and it was getting bolder. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Who are you?" I shouted into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" The whispers answered, a chorus of sinister voices that filled my mind. "Your soul," they hissed. "We want your soul." I lashed out with the knife, swinging wildly at the air. I felt it connect with something solid, and a terrible, inhuman scream filled the room. The presence recoiled, but it didn't retreat. It was toying with me, enjoying my fear. Suddenly, I felt something cold and sharp press against my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied. They were chanting now, a dark, ritualistic incantation that made my skin crawl. "He's here," they said. "He's coming for you." I could feel the blade digging into my skin, drawing a thin line of blood. Panic surged through me, and I thrashed wildly, trying to break free. The presence held me down, its strength inhuman. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the pressure vanished. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, leaving me in a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I mustered the strength to crawl back to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and huddled in the corner, clutching the knife to my chest. Sleep was impossible, but I closed my eyes, hoping for a moment of peace. Instead, the visions returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. I saw a figure standing over me, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. It reached out, its fingers long and clawed, and touched my face. I could feel its cold, clammy skin against mine, and I screamed. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back, before it claimed me completely. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The next day, I called a priest. I was desperate, willing to try anything to rid myself of the darkness that had taken over my life. He arrived that afternoon, a kind, older man with a gentle demeanor. He listened to my story without judgment, and then he began to pray. As he recited his prayers, I felt a strange sensational warmth spreading through my body, pushing back the cold. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but I could feel their grip on me loosening. The priest sprinkled holy water around the room, and the darkness recoiled, hissing in anger. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The priest assured me that the presence was weakened, but he warned me that it was not gone. It would return, and when it did, I would need to be strong. That night, I slept for the first time in one that felt like an eternity. My dreams were still haunted by the visions, but they were less intense, less real. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months, but the reprieve was short-lived. The next night, the whispers returned, more sinister and malevolent than ever. The darkness was angry, vengeful. It wanted me to suffer, to pay for daring to defy it. I knew then that I couldn't fight this battle alone. I reached out to my friends, begging for their help. They were reluctant at first, but eventually they agreed. We devised a plan, a way to confront the darkness and banish it once and for all. We gathered in my living room, candles lit, the air heavy with tension. The priest joined us, his presence a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He began to pray, his voice strong and unwavering. As the prayers filled the room, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The darkness writhed and twisted, lashing out at us. We stood firm, refusing to back down. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a chill settled over us. The presence was back, stronger than before. I could feel it, a palpable, suffocating force that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The priest continued to pray, his voice rising above the chaos. The darkness fought back, but we held our ground. My friends clung to each other, their fear palpable. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of agony that made my ears ring. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I knew it was the presence, making its final stand. The priest's prayers grew louder, more urgent, but I could sense his doubt. The darkness fed off it, growing stronger, more aggressive. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if claws were digging into my flesh. "He's here," the whispers hissed. "He wants you." The priest sprinkled more holy water, but it did nothing. The darkness laughed, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. I could feel its breath on my face, its rancid scent filling my nostrils. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the presence receded, leaving me gasping for air. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I could hear my friends' ragged breaths, their fear mirroring my own. The priest's voice trembled as he spoke. "I have done all I can. The darkness is strong, and I fear it will not leave you." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. The priest had been my last hope, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. The priest had been my last hope, and now even he seemed powerless against the darkness. My friends left reluctantly, each one casting sympathetic, frightened glances my way. I was alone again, trapped in my perpetual night. The days blurred into each other, a continuous stream of torment. The whispers never ceased, their hissing voices a constant companion. The presence lingered, always at the edge of my awareness, a malevolent shadow that never left my side. I tried to go on with my life, but it was impossible. The darkness was always there, watching, waiting. It mocked me, tormented me with visions that felt all too real. I saw twisted faces, eyes burning with malice, reaching out to drag me into their abyss. I felt their cold fingers on my skin, heard their hollow laughter echoing in my mind. One night, as I sat in my living room, trying to drown out the whispers with the static of the television, I felt it again, a cold presence that seemed to fill the room. My heart pounded, and I gripped the arms of my chair, too terrified to move. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispers answered, a chorus of sinister voices, "Because you belong to us." I felt something cold and sharp brush against my cheek, and I flinched. The darkness laughed, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from all around me. I could feel it closing in, suffocating me with its malevolence. Desperation clawed at me, and I realized I had to do something, anything, to end this nightmare. I remembered the priest's words, his warning that the darkness would return. But he had also said that I needed to be strong. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I stood up, my legs shaking. "You don't own me," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I won't let you win." The darkness roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of my house. I felt a cold wind whip around me, and the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. But I stood my ground, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "I banish you," I said, my voice growing stronger. "In the name of everything good and pure, I banish you." The darkness shrieked, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was trying to crush the life out of me. But I held on, repeating the words over and over. "I banish you, I banish you." The pressure grew, the darkness closing in around me. I could feel it trying to pull me under, to drag me into its abyss. But I fought back, refusing to give in. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The darkness receded, the whispers fading into nothingness. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. I lay there for what felt like hours, too weak to move. But gradually, I realized something had changed. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges of my awareness. But its grip on me was weaker, its presence less oppressive. I knew then that the battle was far from over. The darkness would never truly leave me. It would always be there, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind. But I had faced it, and I had survived. As the days turned into weeks, I learned to live with the darkness. The whispers were still there, but they were quieter, less insistent. The visions still haunted my dreams, but they were less vivid, less real. I knew I could never escape the darkness completely. It was a part of me now, a scar that would never fully heal. But I had found a way to live with it, to keep it at bay. And so, I went on with my life, blind but not defeated. The darkness was my constant companion, a reminder of the horrors I had faced. But I had learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of my reality. I knew the darkness would never give up, that it would always be waiting for a moment of weakness. But I had faced my demons and survived, and that was enough, for now. The dark never scared me. Many other things did: unopened bills, social gatherings, commitment, according to my ex. But the dark never held any particular terrors for me. Sure, your senses are heightened. I guess it's some kind of evolutionary thing. Sometimes you even see things that aren't there. When I was in the service, during basic training, the brass decided to teach us a lesson about sleep deprivation. I was 3 or 4 days into the maneuvers, on about as many hours of sleep, doing sentry duty in the middle of a dark forest. Suddenly I saw a figure standing a few yards away, completely still, just watching me. I told him to halt and identify himself, but there was no response. For several minutes I was locked in a battle of will with what I eventually realized was the stump of a fallen tree. Naturally, I felt like a complete idiot, but when I told the others about it, they had, practically to a man, experienced something similar. But then there are those special places. I swear, I'm not superstitious or anything. I don't believe in ghosts, but some houses, some floors, some rooms, you walk in and you feel this evil presence, like the place is haunted, and you just want to get the hell out of there. The training room was one of those places. That Tuesday, I arrived at work at 10 to 10. I like to get there a little early. That way, whoever was on the evening shift had time to change and pass on any messages without having to rush. That night, there was nothing special to report. Paul was a bit younger than me, studying law or something and working part-time, which meant that he would probably be gone in a year or two. Like the other guys, he loved working here. As a security guard at a nursing school, there were always opportunities to socialize with the students, 90% of whom were female, helping a damsel in distress who had locked herself out of her room, returning property from the lost and found to grateful students, or just having a chat in the hallways or courtyards, trying, with varying degrees of success, to stay within the bounds of professional conduct. There may also have been occasional use of the video surveillance system that wasn't strictly up to code. That's not for me to say. I preferred the night shift, when there was minimal client contact. I'd bring a book to read, have a bit to eat, and when it was time to make the rounds, that was little more than a welcome opportunity to stretch my legs. Most of all, it was the quiet of the place that appealed to me. This place that was bustling in the daytime, now completely dead and deserted, with me wandering around like the last man on earth. The path I had taken to end up in this line of work was probably different from most. From an early age, I had imagined myself as an academic. I did all the right things, got good grades, secured the funding, was accepted into a top school, my dad's alma mater. Then my dad died, and nothing seemed worthwhile anymore. I didn't open a book for months. I showed up for the first exam, took a quick look at the page, and nothing made sense. It wasn't that I didn't understand the questions. I could probably have bullshitted my way through it and pulled off a passing grade. But it all just seemed so meaningless, like nothing had any relation to anything at all in the world I knew. I stood up and walked out, and never came back. I think others cared more than I did. People talked of wasted talent, low-earning jobs, uncertain future. I was just happy to be left alone, free from any pressure or responsibility, disposing of my own time the way I wanted. I had been dating a girl in college for a few weeks. We promised each other we would give it a try, but I think we both knew it wouldn't work, and we soon drifted apart. More freedom, fewer obligations. Once Paul had gone, I popped my dinner, or should I say breakfast, in the microwave and got my book out. An old M.R. James I had picked up at an antiquarian. After a couple of hours, I decided it was time to do the rounds. I got the phone, the keys and the flashlight, locked up the office and went outside. It was a clear, cold night. There was no moon, so the stars were out in numbers. The snow that had fallen the day before had congealed into a thin layer of frost, so the ground gave off a crisp crunch for each step. I followed the perimeter of the school, checking doors and windows. The building was an old red brick one, built in the 19th century. It consisted of a tall central tower-like structure, flanked by two lower wings. It had been a hospital before St. Luke was built on the outskirts of town in the 1960s, at which point it was turned into a nursing school. After I had done an outside control of the residential buildings, a few minutes away, I came back for the interior check. Though the school looked old and traditional from the outside, the inside had been renovated quite recently, and the staff and students had all modern facilities at their disposal. We were not really supposed to, but I always took the elevator to the top floor. I knew I would be in big trouble if I got stuck, but fortunately, there had been no problems so far. From the top I made my way downwards, making sure the building was in fact empty, turning off any lights, projectors, coffee machines, and so on. Below the ground level, there were two more basement floors, and once I was done with what was called U2, the rounds were over. This last floor consisted of a long corridor, with doors leading to rooms mostly used for storage, or offices and locker rooms for the janitorial and cleaning staff. Then, at the end of the corridor, was the training room. Rumor had it this was where the most irredeemable mental patients had been held, the violent, the criminally insane. Here they were strapped to their beds, screams muffled by thick walls, dead to the world. There was also talk of hauntings, tormented spirits unable to leave their place of last repose behind. Be that as it may, once the building became a school, it had been transformed into a room with dummies into rows of hospital beds lining the walls. Here the students could practice their skills, anything from bedside manners to CPR or the administering of medications, under the supervision of their instructors and without any grave consequences should they make mistakes. There were of course no windows down here, and the atmosphere was somber under the fluorescent lights. To lighten the mood, perhaps, they had installed a giant, lit-up smiley symbol on the far wall. To me, though, this was the creepiest thing of all. The big yellow face like a deranged, all-seeing deity, cheerfully surveying its domain of tortured captives. The dummies' mouths were open as if in screams of soundless agony, their eyes and ears closed so they would never know when their next punishment were to commence. As always, I wanted to get out as soon as possible, but as I was heading for the door, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I registered movement. Had one of the dummies moved? Was I losing my nerve down here, or my mind? It was probably just time to get back to the office and put on some coffee. I turned to my right and everything was still, but something was off nevertheless. As I walked up to one of the dummies, it seemed different. Instead of the dumb, gaping rubber mask, it seemed to have a real, human face. Not just any face, it seemed to me, but my own face, only bruised and infinitely sad. As I stared, I remembered exactly where and when I had seen that face before. It was my first year in college, and I was going home for Christmas. My dad had picked me up from the airport, and I was driving. It was the same Volvo station wagon we'd had since I was a kid, the one I had learned to drive in. My dad was very fond of that car, and refused to trade it in no matter how old and ramshackle it got. Outside, the windshield wipers were working frantically to keep the snow off. As so often during that period, we were arguing. I had decided to major in English Lit, and he was concerned I might regret it. Thinking back now, I can easily see it from his side. He had grown up in poverty and gone on to get a degree in engineering. Through hard work, he had managed to secure a good life for himself and for us, his family. That was what education was to him, an insurance against want and uncertainty. He was never condescending or angry. His concern came from love. Back then, however, I didn't see it that way. I had been a reader all my life, and all I wanted was to work with books, to teach, perhaps to write myself. When someone questioned my choices, I took it as an attack on my integrity. The discussion soon grew heated. I got angry and defensive, yelled at him to mind his own business and leave me alone. That's when, a little too late, I saw the trailer overtaking another car, coming towards us in our lane. I swerved and lost control of the car. Dad didn't make it. I got away with minor injuries. With a bruised face, I lay staring vacantly ahead of me in the hospital bed, hearing the frantic voices of my family down the corridor, like sounds from a detuned radio. I snapped out of it. This dummy. It was probably nothing but an elaborate prank by the others. It wouldn't be the first time. Once we put a skeleton from the anatomy room in the driver's seat of Paul's car. He freaked out completely, and we got it all on video. It was glorious. Was this him getting his revenge? I went over to the bed to have a closer look. It was certainly still a dummy. The back of its head was smooth and rubbery, and there were small gaps where the joints would be. Nor had a mask been strapped onto the head. Was the face painted onto the rubber? If so, it was eerily realistic. I had the sensation of looking into a distorted mirror. Not able to contain myself, I reached out a hand to touch it. Just then, it turned its head and looked me dead in the eye. while it lifted up the covers to put its feet on the ground. I ran like a madman, shuffling my feet on the polished linoleum floor. It felt like running in a nightmare, where my legs would not follow my commands and barely moved in spite of all my efforts. Behind me I thought I heard footsteps, like rubber soles on the floor of a quiet library. Out the door I ran, down the long corridor, where in the end I could see the light coming out of the elevator. Reaching it, I stumbled inside, and as the doors closed behind me, I heard a sickening thud. It was the lights going out. I was now in complete darkness, and the thundering sound of my heart seemed to fill the small room. I reached out trying to find the control panel, but there was something in front of me. Something soft and hard at the same time. Suddenly I remembered that I had my flashlight on my belt. I grabbed it and fumbled wildly for the button. The light came on, and I saw it. The dummy was in the elevator with me. The thing had its back to me, neck bent, looking at the control panel as if it had forgotten which floor it wanted. Suddenly it jerked its head up and slowly started turning around, and as it did, I just knew, that it was no longer my face it was wearing. I had not prayed since I was a kid, but now I prayed fervently, silently, please God, not that, anything but that. But I knew it was no use. As the thing turned around completely, I looked straight into what I feared the most in the whole world, the face of my father. Not the face I had seen every day growing up, and more infrequently after that, the kind, inquisitive eyes, the shy, playful smile always on his lips, that unkempt head of only slightly graying hair. No, this was his face as I had seen it that last time, in the car before the paramedics pulled me out. The face I looked into now was covered in blood. His eyes were looking into mine beseechingly, scared and confused, and his jaw looked like no human jaw should ever look, not aligned with his face at all, but smashed into the back of his throat, like a crushed beer can. This thing, it was just standing there in front of me, leaning forward slightly, showing me what I had so desperately been trying to forget, as if it was proud of what it had made. But it wasn't done yet. Oh no, there was still one little part of my memory it had yet to access, to make the picture complete. Out of what should have been a mouth came that sound I had thought I would never hear again, the sound I had spent years, waking or sleeping, trying to forget, that wheezing, gargling sound, like a cry for help drowned in blood. Up until that point I had been frozen with terror, but now I screamed. I screamed and screamed, covering my eyes with my hands as I fell to the floor, and everything went completely, mercifully black. I woke from something hitting my head, over and over. I opened my eyes and realized it was the elevator door. As I had collapsed with my head in the opening, I was back on the ground floor, and I could see the light from the guard room. Outside, it was still dark. I left my gear, picked up my things, and walked out into the pure, cool night air. Never in my life had I imagined that I would leave my post before being relieved, but now I didn't even hesitate. In the morning they would call, angry, confused, worried. Let them. I'd be far gone by then. All I knew was that I would never set my foot in that building again, or, probably, that town. I'd go home, gather what little stuff I owned, load it in the car, and just drive. Of course, I could not tell anyone what had happened. They would laugh, blame hallucinations, a particularly vivid dream. But I knew what I had seen. There was something living in that basement. If it was human, I don't know. Maybe it had been human at some point. Perhaps the most frightful thing was the complete lack of malice it showed. It just needed to feed off my fear, my pain, my trauma, like a hawk, casually eating the entrails of a still alive dove. Now, perhaps it was sleeping, waiting for its next victim. Never mind, there was nothing I could do about that. All I could do was put as much distance as possible between myself and the training room.